I've played games since before I could remember. I had a PS1 that my dad got me when I was really young. All it had on it was Spyro and HBO Boxing, but I remember it taking a hold of me like nothing else had before. But it's not like I exactly cared about stories. Video games were supposed to be just about fun, you know? It wasn't until about middle school that I actually started to pay attention to stories and everything like that. So when I first played a game about a blue-haired emo anime teenager, honestly, it was a bit boring. The combat was at least interesting. It definitely messed with the JRPG formula in a way that I found more interesting, and yet I still didn't get past the first month. I chalk that up to my easily bored young mind. So I watched a YouTube video of the Two Best Friends channel playing the sequel, Persona 4. My interests were piqued. I played through Persona 4 and was instantly hooked. I played through Persona 3 and realized what a mistake I made not going through that entire game. Those games gave me some of the best memories I ever had in gaming. The absolute genius design of switching gameplay styles constantly to keep things fresh, the over the top aesthetic, clever use of theming and motifs that I've never really experienced in a game before, and most importantly to me, the interesting characters and how they drew me in with how real they felt and how relatable situations they were in. Obviously, not counting the whole shadow fighting side of it, everything from learning about a young and inexperienced new stepmother trying to interact with her husband's child, to a teenage uncle trying to come to terms with his failing knee and the end of his track career, everything felt relatable. Obviously, I'm not a stepmother, or, hell, very athletic. However, it still felt real, and it made me empathetic to their issues, because they felt like real people. People I could relate to. They were always so well written that I could always place myself in the shoes of people who I consider myself to be polar opposites to. This is a series that's really special to me, and that's really shaped me as a person, and it became my favorite JRPG series of all time, bar none. So, when Persona 5 finally came out, I got it as soon as I got the money and played it straight through. I was hooked the entire 110-hour playthrough. It was like a dream. The gameplay was amazing, the style was incredible, the story really grabbed me. The hours flew by as I was changing hearts and helping this new group of friends through their issues. I remember it being 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning in my time when I finally got to the big reveal near the end in the Velvet Room. And I knew two things in my heart. I was close to the end, and I had work the next day, and I knew which one was more important to me. I fought the final area, challenged the final boss, and laid back in my bed, admiring the good work I'd done as the final scenes began to play. I looked at my confidants fighting for me, my friends greeting me as I got out of jail, and I think that's the moment I began to realize that something didn't really feel right. I walked around the now familiar city, and I didn't feel anything. I said goodbye to Kawakami, the one I decided to romance. I didn't really care. I listened to Mishima, who I personally found was the highlight confidant in Persona 5, talk about his new life goals and how he didn't want to settle for mediocrity, something probably more relatable to me than any other social link in the past, and I felt nothing. I couldn't even care less about talking to everyone. Morgana warned me when I was leaving that I'd miss a few people, and frankly, I didn't even care to look around. It really set in for me when I got to the final cutscene. My friends had gotten a van all set up to take me home. We left Tokyo, and as I looked back down at the protagonist who stared up triumphantly, with the theme playing on the radio behind him, I realized something. Something that might not be as relatable to some of you, but was very strange to me. That I wasn't crying. The end of Persona 3 touched me in such a deep way, I couldn't help but shed a tear. Knowing how much I've helped my friends in Persona 4, and watching them run after me as I took the train back, I cried then too. But I didn't shed a single tear for Persona 5. And believe me, I tried. The sun was just coming up, and I felt in the pit of my stomach as I stared at the ceiling trying to get a few hours of rest. something was very wrong. I know I enjoyed the game, but why didn't I enjoy it as much as the rest? When I played through it, I thought it was, in some ways, better than before. So, that's the question I'm trying to answer today. I'm going to look at the three most important pieces of a game: the gameplay, the story, and the aesthetics, and compare Persona 5 to the games prior to really determine what went wrong, or if anything did, and it's just me growing out of my favorite series. I'm trying to find that out today. To begin with gameplay. The Persona series is known for switching between a 3D visual novel, revolving around solving a mystery and surviving high school within our own reality, and a dungeon crawling aspect that involves using personas, a representation of the facade we put on to the outside world, based on the major arcana in tarot cards taken physical form, to fight shadows and other people taking advantage of this newly discovered otherworld. As such, I'll be talking about Persona 3 and 4 systems shortly to compare to 5's. I'll be splitting up the gameplay section into two pieces: dungeon crawling and visual novel. So, to begin with dungeon crawling. Persona uses a system of JRPG combat that puts the player in a much more active role than most JRPGs, rewarding a certain level of skill. The shadows in 3 and 4 look like amorphous blobs while you explore the other world, and you have to land an attack on them in order to begin a battle. Simple enough, but this raises several scenarios, such as waiting for a shadow to turn around in order to land a perfect strike and gain an advantage in battle, or running from one group of shadows and getting blindsided by another, putting you in a worse situation than you were before, since now this group and the other group have an upper hand on you. It makes the crawling aspects of the dungeons much more interesting than a classic randomized battle system on a grid, and is something that's always drew me into the series. 5 nails this exploration amazingly well, and expands on it in ways that I thought were incredible. You can now hide behind corners, and have to jump on the enemies to tear off their masks and begin a fight with advantage. There are many moments where I was hiding behind corners, timing cameras moving and dogs sniffing out my location, in order to either sneak by the enemy without issue, or surprise them. The key here is that they understood what attracted people to the system in the first place: the active role the player took in order to gain advantage in a fight, and amps it up, throwing in stealth in order to make the moments tense and explosive when fights began. I remember specifically I was in the pyramids for Futaba. I had no idea how many floors were left, but I had done huge swaths of the dungeon already, so I pressed on. Halfway through the next section on my way to the save point, I was hit by a particularly bad battle that left me and my team extremely weak. It was a risky move, but I used this active gameplay to press forward, hiding behind walls and running away from getting spotted constantly, knowing fully well I did not have the HP, SP, or items to live for another fight. It's these great, exciting, intense moments that were greatly expanded on in 5, and for the better, in my opinion. I was always excited to steal another heart because of this. What about the combat? The Persona series has been known for using what I like to call a one more system. There are multiple elements that each Persona and Shadow are both strong and weak against. Think Pokemon. Water is strong against fire, fire is strong against grass, and grass is strong against water. If hit with something the Shadow is strong against, they take less damage. However, if it is weak, not only does it take extra damage, but it gets knocked down and gives the attacker an extra turn. If you manage to knock down every enemy, you can perform an all-out attack. Basically, everyone not knocked down in your party gets a free attack and deals massive damage. However, your enemies were able to pull off knockdowns on you and your party as well, utilizing their own one more system with the potential of dealing massive damage to your party. This made every encounter exciting and incredibly fun to plan and execute. You had to think about what each party member was good at and how well your various personas could cover their shortcomings. Going into a new area was nerve-wracking on higher difficulties, since a new group of enemies with unknown weaknesses could just as easily knock down your team in a few hits. When you finally memorized each enemy's weakness, it became a flawless dance that you could recreate every time, picking each right persona and party member for the job and executing each enemy flawlessly. And just before you got too cocky, every few floors had a new enemy. This incredible system allowed for a very dynamic feel to the gameplay that was only expanded on in 5. Yet again, the developers knew what was fun about the previous games and expanded upon it. Yet again, the developers knew what was fun about the previous games and expanded upon it. They've added all new elements and expanded on older ones, bringing more to the table to remember and more to experiment with. Some elemental attacks like Hama or Mudo, which were light and dark insta-kill moves, had a small percent chance of landing, which makes them a lot less fun to use, especially since you could not use them against bosses. Here, they added more attacks with light and dark that actually did damage, making characters utilizing those moves a lot more viable to bring in every scenario. The gun was also an excellent decision. Ever since the change of physical damages from 3 to 4 took away all but one physical form of damage, I always thought that was a silly decision to make. And frankly, I could not think of more of a reason to do that than to dumb the game down. 5 keeps most physical moves under a single damage type, but added in gun moves. Not only could every character use either an attack or a gun move, but everyone's moves are different. Do you want Anne to unload her Tommy gun on a team of fairies? Or would you hold out for another, more accurate user and risk the fairies attacking you? Also, the fact that the extra bullets were so rare made things even more interesting and added a lot more choices to the fight. You know you can unload every bullet you have into this strong enemy that's weak to bullet damage, but you could also pull back after knocking them down and use the extra turn for another different attack. Then there's a new system of assists, where you can high-five a friend with a high enough social link and let them take over and have extra damage or healing on their next move, adding yet another layer of the decision making. At its heart, the developers remembered that this was a JRPG system, where the most fun comes from decision making in and out of combat. From that end, they added in their own spin of having some active and skill-based scenarios in order to gain advantage, but never forgot that the core of the fun came from calculated and snap decisions that had a real impact on gameplay and story. One mechanic that one could argue is brought back from older titles is the hold-up mechanic. This means that instead of facing shadows and gaining personas through a timing-based minigame, you knock down every enemy and get the chance to either all-out attack or talk to one of them. If you do talk to one, you have to convince it to give you money, an item, or join your team. I like the system a lot more than just gaining a persona through a minigame like 3 and 4 had done, yet it's a little bit unpolished. Yes, they tell you the personality of each persona before you talk to them, and that lets you get a general idea of the responses they'll like to hear from you. But even knowing that, it felt as though it was nearly random on what response you were supposed to give. Luckily, your friends can help convince the hard-to-persuade personas, and you can just remember the responses, so I never had that much of an issue with it. It was never so much of an issue I did not enjoy it, but to improve, I hope they add a lot more questions, personalities, and make it a bit more clear what each personality likes to hear in 6. The bosses of the series have always been a challenge, and here's where I felt they may have dropped the ball slightly. I remember in 3 and 4 having to go back and level, fuse different personas multiple times, and generally work a lot harder, not only to find a strategy that worked, but to execute it. Especially near the end of 5, I cannot remember dying to a boss once. They were absolutely fun, but as soon as I found out what I could exploit, they usually became trivial. The hardest boss was probably Madarame, as it was too early in the game to get good resistances, and Madarame was the one who took me the longest to find a good order for the weaknesses for each of the different pieces of his painting, and a way to kill them all at the same time so he could not revive. Although I died once or twice in future dungeons, I had so many resistances that it was never a real issue like it was in previous games. This I don't believe was a massive issue, and maybe it could have been improved by me playing on the hardest difficulty, but it should still be mentioned that I did not really fear the bosses like I did in previous games. They also, thankfully, took the lessons from 4 and did not make the boss battles monthly, which I felt really restricted them unnecessarily in 3. It's not a big deal, but I'd like to commend the devs on remembering that decision. The game also allows you to go through an essentially endless dungeon area called Mementos. You see, after you complete a palace, which is what the game's dungeons are called for each of the main bosses, they collapse, so you can't go back inside. But Mementos is there in case you still want to do some exploring, and dungeon crawling, and leveling up. Think Tartarus, but its central purpose, for most of the game, is side quests. This was never honestly very interesting or fun to do. When I did eventually go in, after letting a few side quests build up, I steamrolled smaller enemies and bosses which should have been hard,
If I was so over that level, I'd cleaned house on each one easily. The rewards never really felt worth it. I really only pushed myself in there when I had a social link that required someone's heart to be changed. However, every social link does require that, and though it's a little off topic, I felt that was a good decision. I realized what they were trying to do. The side quests in 3 and 4 were less interesting when they involved the dungeons and doing simple things, but they really needed to hone this new system to make it, well, more interesting. On the topic of crafting personas, 5 reused what was essentially the same system as 3 and 4, but with a lot of quality of life improvements, like being able to choose your persona's moves and inherit it, and being able to put them out of commission for a week of game time in order to make them stronger against their weaknesses. Not a lot to say here, except that I noticed these small changes, and I want to personally thank whoever put these in the game. Your contribution was not overlooked by the community, believe me. You can truly see a game's colors in its smallest details, and it's obvious these devs cared enough to look at the less fun aspects of the last title to improve on it. Ultimately, the dungeon crawling is as fun as it's ever been, and it makes half of the gameplay a blast from start to finish. Moving on to the other half of the game, which takes place in the real world, the more visual novel side of it I mentioned before, this is where the more social aspects take place. Social links, school, vacations, odd jobs. The purpose here is a life simulation of a Japanese teenager, and here the games have always excelled. In 3, the setting was a city that put you in a high school dorm, and 4 put you in a small town, living with your uncle and cousin. It's clear how these games evolved over time as to how they viewed the towns. In 3, they made the city feel easy enough to navigate that I never got lost, and I knew where the prime locations of my stats were. But I never felt as though it was worth it to explore. In 4, they realized this. They made the setting a smaller town. You'd think that this would punctuate the problem with less stuff to do in it, but it was really the opposite. You explored the new town and found many small things like specials on rainy days, and figuring out good fishing spots that immersed you and, as you discovered more, made you feel more at home in Inaba. 5 took what 4 did and applied it to the city setting that 3 had, and it worked extremely well. The first thing that struck me walking into Tokyo was how absolutely striking and intimidating the map system was. When I tried to walk to school, I took so many wrong turns and wrong exits on the subway, I didn't even know which way was up. It frustrated me at first, but as soon as I discovered more and more locations, it became much easier. Soon, I found good places to eat, routes to fishing spots and amusement parks, and some more hidden confidants and secret locations and specials. I found myself in a familiar city in no time, expertly navigating my neighborhood in the subway. And funnily enough, I realized that you could fast travel after visiting a place for the first time very far into the game. If you want my advice though, just walk. Enjoy the ride, as thanks to a lot of good design decisions, even walking around is fun. You are in Tokyo for a year, with a few months left out for the inevitable Persona 5 2. And as such, every section of every day counts. Trying to balance your social life and the Persona battles has always been the name of the game. Here's no exception. 3 and 4 definitely made me a bit anxious, trying to juggle all that and stat raising, mostly because I didn't want to miss out on all the fun options during the story for being courageous enough to stop some of the thugs, or smart enough to outwit someone in class. Stats like that influenced different events of the story were tied to social links and story events, but in 5, they were only in the social links, where you could pick any option in story events no matter how courageous or smart you were. Forgetting about what this does for characterization, I really liked this. I always prioritize courage before anything in the other games in order to pick the coolest options for myself to do in 3 and 4. So now I can just level each at my own pace, or when I want to continue a social link. In Persona 3, you needed to max out one of each social stat in order to date each of the main girls in your party. And in 3 and 4, they made it so you couldn't begin certain social links without stats at a certain level. In 5, they decided to make each stat requirement more appropriate for each situation by requiring different levels of a stat at different points. This is a bit confusing, but for example, you don't need max courage in order to ask out an intimidating girl, but you will need it in order to continue on some other social links past rank 5 or 6, with more intimidating people like a Yakuza. Some party members still need high stats to continue down their paths with, but since most of them at least let you get to rank 5 or 4, you get enough rewards from the confidant bonuses that they're still usable alongside characters like Ryuji, Well, I maxed out without a single maximized social stat, and I was able to get his special moves and dungeons for. With a healthy supply of secrets and minigames, and a fun city to just walk around in, the creators of Persona 5 made what should have been the most mundane task in the world, walking around a city, a fun maze that's constantly a blast to walk through, no matter how far I got in the game. The VN aspect of Persona 5 is as good as it ever was. Even the way these two scenarios intersect with one another has been improved. Moving in between the social gameplay and the dungeon crawling lets you never get bored of either, which was always one of the best and most impressive design decisions of Persona. If I ever, and I really did, got bored of dungeon crawling, I could just kick back with Junpei. And if a certain nurse's social link got a bit too draining, I could always hop back into the fun JRPG combat. It kept the game fresh constantly, causes massive binging sessions. Try to look for this in other games that have two very distinct styles of gameplay. You might find that you binge them a lot more often than others. I always find it easier to play games for longer periods if there's a gameplay separation like this, as I never get burnt out of one side too badly. The genius of the Persona series is still present here, but now with the Confidant system, things connected in both worlds in much more interesting ways. In 3 and 4, you always gain a new persona at the 10th rank of a social link, and some of your team members became willing to take a hit for you, or could knock down the other team after you knocked one down. Special skills that you got after you reached a certain level with them. Unfortunately, you didn't really get anything for side characters, except for the persona. In the dungeons, you could find items for side missions and craft personas that get the most out of your meetings with your friends. For example, if you had a persona of the Lover's Arcana, then hanging out with Rise and choosing an option when talking to her that would normally net you 2 points would get you 3. Yet again, Persona 5 expands on this greatly. First, Mementos missions, although they take place in a fairly boring and long dungeon, affect your social links, and random citizens can request your help at all the time. You also need certain skills to help you through battles, which you can actually learn from certain social links. Everything, from Futaba changing the cognition of the monsters so they begin knocked down, to you learning insane gunslinging moves that can knock down even shadows with no weaknesses or a full clip of ammo. Speaking of, do the mission where you learn about the guy who's cheating at the arcade immediately. Don't ask, just don't make the mistake I did and figured this out during the last month. Now that you gain so many different skills and services from every social link at a lot of different social levels, suddenly you have a second reason to do them, rather than just hearing the story. Putting smaller rewards in a closer range, like 3 meetings, rather than doing months of meeting with them, getting them to level 10, dangles the carrot in front of the player's face, a lot closer, making us much more interested in not only the Confidant, but gaining their skills. This intersection of gameplay and story was expanded upon in an amazing way in this game. I hope something similar to the Confidant system stays in future games, as having all these small rewards for already interesting characters makes everything you do with them incredibly rewarding. That largely wraps up the gameplay portion. And yet, I still don't have my answer. Everything is improved gameplay-wise, so why do I not feel as attached to the game as I did before? I had a blast playing Persona 5, but unfortunately, gameplay is not all there is in a game. And now we're going to have to look at the next section of importance to critiquing a game: aesthetics. Aesthetics are essentially what most people think of when you lump together graphics and music in order to produce the atmosphere and visual and auditory themes. To begin, speaking from a purely technical standpoint, Persona 5 is a last generation title. This is not something Persona fans are particularly not used to, since the games take so long. It's not uncommon for the team to begin making the game in the lifespan of one console and end around the time of the next in line comes out. Personally, when I look at a game and review it in my own head, I don't look purely at the graphics. Unless it's for something that's specifically shooting for perfect visuals, I usually only take into account how the team created an art style using the graphics, rather than how many triangles were on the screen at one time. I feel it would be dishonest not to mention, however, that this is essentially a PS3 game. I played on PS3, and the load times were a bit better on PS4, obviously, but ultimately did not make much of a difference graphically besides pop-in timing for characters in the overworld, which honestly did get a little bit annoying. This is nothing new. Persona 4 came out for PS2 2 years after the PS3 launch, but it's worth mentioning. The Persona series has always had its own style for each game, reinforced by every small detail they could throw in. Persona 3 dealt with death, and the Evoker, which is what you use to get out your persona, was a gun that simulated shooting yourself. What always impressed me, though, was how much style oozed from each action. It made the gameplay very interesting too, and I got excited getting a new character just to see the new things they would do. Using your evoker had a different animation for each character. Each character had different animations and tools for fighting that tied in with their character, but the evoker specifically allowed the character to have a lot more personality in combat. It could be your cool, uncaring protagonist, twirling it for flair before flinging his head back from the impact of the bullet. Yukari, still holding on tight and somewhat afraid with the barrel to her forehead, like in the intro. Or Akihiko, with his unwavering courage and sense of strength, took two simple motions before quickly shooting off a shot into his temple. Animations have always been a big part of framing the Persona games and its characters. Something so simple as a walk cycle tells us a lot about a character. Persona 5 is no exception. In fact, Persona 5 took animations to a whole new level. If you want a prime example, simply try pausing your game. Each piece of the UI has different actions, artwork, and option placement that makes it not only easy to navigate, but amazing to go through every time. This sense of style is something that is actually so important to the game, it's everywhere. The main character could simply hit a shadow from the back to get a surprise attack, not unlike the last few games, but instead they jump in a flash of darkness from corner to corner to ultimately flip onto the back of the monster and tear the mask from their face, showing its true form. You walk around like a runway model, helping to characterize you more in a game where you're essentially playing a blank slate. Hell, at the end of the game, look at the final boss. I have to warn everyone here, although I thought it might be obvious, that this is a critique, and as such I'll be going into spoilers. So it would be better if you turned off the video now, if you didn't know that, and played through the game before I went on. Anyway, looking at the final boss. It's a robot god representing order, whose movements are all precise and mechanical. All practicality. Nothing wobbly, bending, absolutely machine-like, and the perfect example of order. Versus you, the teenager. The symbol of disorder, who's been flipping, sneaking, and stylishly shooting his way through the rest of the game. The theme of a corrupt order versus a purifying chaos has been subtle and not so subtle throughout the game, but this animation was the ultimate factor in it coming together in the end. And the game is full of countless more times when animations were important to framing the whole game as they were before in 3 and 4. Color is another obvious aesthetic choice, present throughout all the Persona games. In 3, blue was used as the primary color of not only the UI, but the protagonist's hair, and many other instances in Tartarus, as a way of giving off a more somber feeling. The UI constantly reminded me of the color of night. Midnight, to be exact. Fear of death looming over you constantly, reminding you even when out with your friends or watching the day change from morning to afternoon, that death was always potentially a few hours away. Yellow was the primary color in 4, and as such, the game had a more upbeat feel to it. You saw yellow and instantly associated with the bright, upbeat pop and the retro TV aesthetic. But it also meant more, and although I feel as I might be reaching slightly, as the game was centered around the fog and truth becoming less and less clear, the only times your world would become safe, and the truth was revealed, was when the bright yellow sun shone through the clouds and revealed the truth. In every bad ending, and the new good ending with Marie in 4, the sun was obviously symbolic for the truth, making yellow the perfect color for the game. And in 5 we had red. When one looks at red, one thinks of blood, danger, evil, chaos. Looking at the costumes of your friends and yourself, it was generally the same feeling. All black or red, and based off famous thieves, the whole game, I largely questioned my actions as a criminal. And I always thought about, what if someone used the powers I'm using now for evil? And is it really right for me to essentially brainwash people in order to achieve my justice? Morally, I felt as if I was not only in a gray area, but definitely leaning towards the darker side. But in the end, it had to be that way. Order had gotten too powerful and greedy. It was time for chaos to take it down a notch. Each criminal in the game used systems of order, commonly associated with good and nice colors like gold and white, while we use this new and chaotic system to save people. Red and black were genius colors to use, because it essentially made the bad guys, in most stories, into the heroes. A bit of a spoiler, but look at Goro Akechi's costume. Instantly different because of all the white and military-like design. Goro's outfit represented order. Goro represented order, ultimately, and foreshadowed his betrayal. It was a bit on the nose in my opinion, but it was still foreshadowed nonetheless. Red, the color associated all over the world and in every culture with danger, became the symbol of hope in the form of the Phantom Thieves, when those who should have been looking out for the well-beings of the lesser man instead exploited the masses, wearing lighter and beautiful colors the entire time. In the end, I began to associate red with good, and yet I still associated it with chaos. I think that's what the game was going for, and it pulled it off spectacularly. Music genres used have always been important to the aesthetic of games. All games, Persona especially though. 3 had a lot more hard rap, made battles and tense situations amplified with this feeling the music and lyrics gave off against constantly fighting to stay alive. Just listen to the main battle theme of 3, after the baby 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 part. Shadow, 10 o'clock direction, constantly talking about seizing the moment, fighting off different shadows at all different angles. Rap, mostly being about people living in tough situations, coupled with the lyrics of the main fight song, plus the general feeling you got from very heavy beats, overwhelm the player subconsciously of this feeling of always fighting. Personally, when you relate this back to the theme of death, you could see it as an allegory for depression, constantly fighting off the demons to move forward and not end yourself prematurely. Every night could be another night where you're looking up at your bed, or fighting personas, and you don't have to go on anymore, but you keep fighting. Persona 4 has a more pop idol feel to every song, evoking a much more upbeat theme to it than Persona 3 in even Persona 4's darker situations. It was always an upwards battle to look for the truth in the game, to get past the fog and look to the yellow light above all the lies. And the game constantly pushes you up with its music. You pull yourself up, of course, through the gameplay, but you ultimately never stopped reaching out for the truth when you played and figured it all out for yourself, coupled in part with the music constantly moving you forward and up. In 5, at first, it seems as though the game was going for more of a soft jazz vibe. Historically, again, jazz has been played by people who have been screwed over by society, living in tough situations, and this matches the characters in the game perfectly, where each confidant has essentially been screwed by the established order, be it Kawakami being pressured into not helping her student, or Futaba being pushed into being a hermit by being traumatized by corrupt government officials who blamed her for her mother's death. This was the case until I got to the dungeons and heard Last Surprise and recognized the genius of it immediately. They switched genres from jazz to something more rock-oriented and upbeat in order to show differences between the downtrodden overworld and the sudden chance at life changing through the metaverse. I felt as though the game became less consistent with the two genres tugging over the theme, then realized they worked together. Ultimately, I'm glad they made this decision, as it really helped place you in the shoes of someone living in an area where those above you keep you down, and suddenly you get the chance to change things. The aesthetics are all here, and live up to the series standards. Frankly, this could not possibly be why I did not attach myself to the game as much. Yes, next I have to look at the story of the game, what many, including myself, consider to be the most important part of a JRPG, in order to find out why I did not feel for the game like I have in the past. The plot of the Persona game since 3 largely goes like this. A student has to move to a new town and enters into a new school, largely alone in the world, until they realize they have stumbled upon a massive new world where they learn they have the power to control personas. Using this power, they fight in this world in order to uncover the mystery behind it and how it is affecting your own world. It may sound formulaic, and to a point I wouldn't disagree with you, but I've never minded it because of all the different things done within these parameters. The Dark Hour in P3, being an extra hour in the day, where demons roam the streets and every human sleeps inside a coffin, is so immensely creative of a setup, while being so simple. Just another hour of the day that no one notices. Except, of course, for those who are out of their coffins and either get eaten and begin fighting in the shadows. P4 separates the worlds through the TV, allowing certain people the ability to move in and out of what is essentially an alternate reality, populated by the absolutely unoppressed version of a real world person's true feelings. The more interesting part is where these stories intersect with the real world, with P3 allowing certain people to be gifted with the aforementioned ability to not be in a coffin after midnight, and P4 having the fog play a part in determining whether or not the shadows inside would be hostile enough to attack those who were trapped in the TV with them, or in the worst case scenario, move out of the TV and attack the real world. Persona 5 keeps to the mold by moving this main character to Tokyo and giving him an app which allows you to travel into the soul of a person, physically a castle or a vault, some place where you would keep a treasure, which contains their inner desires and true thoughts. You still have a very direct impact on the world, and this time, it's extremely morally ambiguous. You can kill the personification of the person whose palace you're entering's true desires, which essentially would make them brain dead and unable to want anything, including food and water. I really struggled learning about this, and I thought the game was about to set up an intense moral decision in every palace. Was the crimes of this person so evil that I would be willing to put them in a comatose state? Is that justice? Unfortunately, the game essentially takes that option away by saying you can just convince the person in the palace and they'll do whatever you want by telling them to. Disappointing, but still, I struggled. It was essentially brainwashing, and even though these people were evil, was I willing enough to take away their free will to achieve a semblance of justice for their actions? I liked how the game really made me question myself about this, but I hated that it never really gave me the opinion to decide for myself if it was right or not. In fact, the only one who argues against you is Akechi. I appreciated that the game added in him arguing with you in very reasonable ways, but I suppose it goes to show what the game thinks of that based on how he turned out. In any case, while it lasted, it was a good moral quandary, and it contributes to the overall theme of order versus chaos. But I do feel disappointed the game never expanded on both sides of the argument past Goro. A large portion of the game, I was not thinking about things thematically. I was exploring the world and keeping my view very small scale. It wasn't until a friend of mine mentioned how each boss represented a deadly sin that the idea of order versus chaos I touched on before really came about in my mind. Persona games having a central theme is nothing new, and ultimately one of their strongest tools in tying the game together. Persona 3, again, dealt with death and its inevitability. Even in the first opening cinematic, it talked about how you were going to die. Orpheus, the main character's first persona, dies at the end of his story as well. And ultimately, the lesson you teach yourself is that you can either live through hardship or simply accept the inevitability that is death. Persona 4 was all about finding the truth, and how complicated it could become determining what truth was more valid. Was your truth simply wanting things to be over and stopping at one of the earlier suspects in the game, like the police? Would you stop at the true culprit? Or would you go to the very end, even risking your own life and the lives of your friends to discover the truth? Persona 5 essentially made its theme of order versus chaos, and tells us that if order becomes evil, then chaos is the answer. It's a balancing game. The bosses of the game being representative of the 7 deadly sins, while at the same time being highly influential figures that are essentially above normal laws and cannot be touched by normal means, shows us a world where order has failed to help people, and is instead an avenue of exploitation. Dressed as, and using the representations of the greatest thieves and outlaws in history, the Phantom Thieves fight using a chaotic new method to bring these people to justice. The 7 deadly sins ultimately came to represent another orderly institution, religion. The true final boss fight, and the subsequent fights prior, really showed off this theme greatly. You fought the 4 archangels to get to the Garden of Eden, the final boss room. There you battled against the god of order, and in the end, when you had no other way to win against this massive force essentially keeping down the world through mass brainwashing, you summoned the ultimate being of chaos, Satan, to deliver the fruit of knowledge, in the form of a bullet straight through the head of God, freeing the people from his grasp. Now, I don't think this game is anti-religion, but I do think it is ultimately anti-establishment when it's needed. You still have characters who want to join these forces of order and make them better, like Makoto when she's joined the police force. And you meet people within these corrupt institutions trying to make them a better place. Like during Yusuke's Confidant when he meets the person trying to pay for him to go to art school. The answer isn't anarchy. The game's not trying to say that. The game's not trying to say that full chaos is the answer. It's trying to say that the answer is to change the institutions for the better. If you want more proof, look at what happened with the fake Igor as he offered you a world where the Phantom Thieves could go on forever. If you went down this path, you ultimately took a bribe and became not unlike those you fought before. A corrupt institution that takes bribes and is willing to sell out the rest of mankind for their own selfish wishes. Ultimately, I find the theme of chaos versus order to really have thrown the dichotomy of good versus evil on its head, and was very smartly done in this game. One interesting aspect to this story is the characterization of the main character. The earlier games had small amounts of characterization, but largely left open who the character was to make it so the player could better identify with them. In P3, I got the sense that the protagonist was a depressed teenager who could be a real jerk, but still care about others at the same time, and was ultimately willing to sacrifice himself because he found something to live for in the end. P4, I got the sense that the main character had an immensely dry wit with a cool head, but not much else. In fact, I think the anime did a great job nailing not only his character, but we as those who played as him. I want to talk about a particular episode of the anime in a separate episode of my own, actually. But enough about you. Get it? Okay. P5 decided to make the character have a clear personality. Cocky. You can see it in the smirks he flashes in the first cutscene, his dialogue choices, especially with Mishima, and actions in other scenes. The fact that you can tell Kamoshida, good morning, after you know that you're going to take his soul, shows a level of ballsiness that the other protagonists didn't show just as commonly, or without a courage stat being up. This has good and bad parts to it, in my opinion. The good being he feels like a real teenager. If you're a beautiful, tall, and stylish Harry Potter type, you'd be a bit full of yourself too. It also doesn't sacrifice from the good nature in his heart, since we see at the beginning us beating up a sexual abuser and ending up getting a record because of it. However, because they treat him more like his own character, I start to see him as more of his own character. I see him not as myself some of the time, but as Akira. And because of that, I thought more about how he might have grown throughout the story. In the end, he doesn't, of course. They're still pretending he's a blank slate, but still, because he was characterized so much more, I thought of him more as a character, and I became more disappointed overall. It has its pros and cons, but I feel they dipped a bit far over into actual character territory, and it hurt my experience overall. Now, it's at this point I'm going to talk about the plot. I'm not going to bring up Persona 3 or 4's. Although it's a sequel, and as such it should be compared to its previous titles, I feel as though it would be better to let this section stand on its own 2 feet, as the theming is just so different between all the games, it'd be difficult to compare them, and frankly I don't see a good place it would take us. To begin, your character begins en media res, where it takes us through a quick run through of the new mechanics during a casino heist. Things like jumping, running, sneaking, battling, general tutorial movements are done mostly through doing, and with few moments where the game explains the more complicated aspects, which I find close to the optimal way to do a tutorial. Obviously, it's a JRPG, and there's some things that you just have to explain, but overall, I feel like it left a lot of room for the player to move around and screw up in a safe environment. You eventually get caught by the police and taken in to see just how corrupt the police force is by way of them beating you up and laughing at the idea of video evidence you could use, pushing again the theme that the order is corrupt. The game then puts you in a cell with Sai, where you recall every act of the game. This is very cleverly set up. Every new confidant you meet, every time you win, Every minor celebration you may have, you're drawn back in to the meeting with Sai, trying to rationalize how she can attach you and your accomplices to the crime, dragging you down every time you feel like you've accomplished something. An incredibly smart choice for a game trying to make you feel just as downtrodden and kicked down by the powers that be as everyone else. Another way the game paints everything you do is by the police letting slip the fact that you were sold out by a teammate. This was such a crazy decision. Every party member I got, I suddenly looked at with skepticism. And every time I trusted one, when I furthered their social link, I thought to myself, is it you? It was insanely smart. I still can't get over the initial feeling I had when I heard it. It got me thinking the game would do something along the line of making the one with the lowest social link rank betray you. But as I'll describe later, that all turned out to be too much credit for the game. After this, you describe to Sai taking the train to Tokyo, where you recall why you've been sent away from home. Because you've been sent away for hitting an influential politician, assaulting a young woman, plea bargain allows you to stay in Tokyo for a year under probation, again with the motive of corrupt order pushing you down. Thinking back, I'm actually very impressed. You and almost every character you meet has been hurt by society in some way, and it makes you better sympathize with their struggle, at the expense of some slight problems with self-insertion, of course. But still, you begin to meet party members and realize one of the staff at your new school, Kamoshida, has been hurting and sexually abusing different high school girls. Confronting him, he tells you that in a few weeks he's going to expel you and some other students who confronted him with you. It's at this point you meet up with Morgana, the talking, feline, mascot, essentially, and begin your mission to steal the hearts of those who can't be caught by society's corrupt rules and make them turn themselves in. The rest of the game follows this formula up until the final few areas, and it works well enough. Kamoshida is a prime example of the kind of scum you meet, and I'm going to compare him to one of the weaker villains, whom I had to look up the name of in this review, Kaneshiro. Kamoshida is an ex-Olympic volleyball player, who's the pride and joy of your high school, really rakes in people to the games and keeps the cash flow high. As such, he's pretty much untouchable by the school, as they won't report him for abusing students, and he kicks girls off the team for not having sex with him. You briefly get to know one of the girls, Shiho, who actually attempts suicide because of this. Of course, you can't report him either, because you're just some student with a criminal record. Who'd believe you over him? This constant smugness you have to deal with and the face he puts on to the rest of the polite world is sickening to look at, and you can't wait to get inside his palace. The palaces, like all Persona Other Worlds, are rife with symbolism everywhere. It's literally a castle in place of the school, with his guards being noble-looking knights. His boss form is literally him as a giant beast with 6 arms, a whip to force his small volleyball-playing army to attack you, and a literal gold goblet of teenage girls to restore health. Yes, the boss symbolism is pretty much the worst it's ever been in the series, frankly. But when you escape his palace, you find his treasure, a gold Olympic medal, revealing that his inner desire was truly always to be recognized for being great, and because of that, he treated his school like he was saving a castle and became its king. Kaneshiro, on the other hand, is a gangster, using kids as drug mules and threatening them to keep working afterwards. Scummy. Although you never get to meet one, so it becomes less personal and you care less about it than Kamoshida, with Shiho. The game does a nice job of upping the stakes, however. This is about your 3rd mission, and you're already apprehending a criminal that affects the whole city, not just the school. The engagement curve in this game is literally constant curves rising, falling slightly, and rising yet again. And yet, on a personal level, it did not make me care much for Kaneshiro at all. The reason we're in trouble here, and on a time limit, is because we need to appease his demands in 2 weeks, or else he'll post pictures of us in a nightclub online. Honestly, it's a fairly Japanese premise that I laughed at since, well, if it was where I lived, you'd be kind of a hero. But I suppose if I were from a place that followed these sorts of things closer and with a more traditional lens, it would be world-ending for me too. In his castle, we see the entire city of Tokyo as his personal bank that we break into. His boss form, his boss form is him, but pink, a fly, kind of, and in a massive piggy bank mecha. Again, the boss symbolism is pretty terrible here. We get his desire in the end here too, which is just a briefcase with Kanashiro's face on a bunch of bills. It turns out he was pretty poor when he was a kid and did not ever want to be poor again, so he turned to crime. Honestly, I could not care less. While I still morally had an issue with the brainwashing part, as I mentioned before, I could not care less about what the game was attempting to tell me here, and the different symbols it was trying to throw at me, because I didn't care about Kanashiro. The game needed more situations where you had to be around him and see him and talk to him in order to get you to really care on a personal level. Shio was a great example of this well done. If I had to go and give a suggestion, I would probably suggest, instead of school for a week, make it so the protagonist has to work for him. Really see the dirty stuff he does. Stuff that makes you really mad at him and, really excited to go and kick his butt in the metaverse. The game goes on fairly normally from here, but we do hear tellings of a mysterious new person exploring the metaverse, who would kill people in their palace and shut down their brains, causing countless deaths. The game takes a few more palaces normally like this, so I'd like to talk for a second about the most interesting character to me, and one of the more important for the story. Akechi. At one point, you go to a TV station for a field trip, and meet him on a talk show while you are in the audience. He's a high school detective, kind of like Naoto, but he's a little bit more obsessed with his career. He asks you if you think the Phantom Thieves are just, creating one of those great moments that I was really craving. The thief taunting the detective secretly by him talking to their faces about his crimes. I argued with him about us doing what was right, even if it was not legally right, and he argued back with every concern I had in the beginning of the game about our actions. It was incredible. The game actually addressed the moral concerns I was having, and then some I didn't even think about. As he came up to talk to me afterwards about being glad I could be his antithesis to his thesis, began to be a reoccurring character in cutscenes where he talks to Sai and shows up at the coffee shop. The rest of the party despised this guy, but I always felt bad for him. Especially at different parts of the game where he's treated as the bad guy and the world is ragging on him. He comes into your shop and you get the option to essentially tell him, pardon my French, to fuck off. But I always try to be nice to him. The kid obviously didn't have any friends and was overwhelmed by his work and school. So I try to give him a break. It seems like society was screwing with him too, and I even suspected he'd become a party member later. Eventually, that wish came true when he figured out it was us who were the Phantom Thieves and joined up in order to change Sai's mind about the investigation on us and to ultimately disband the Phantom Thieves. It was suddenly at the point where I first saw him in his costume, I threw out a lot of respect for the game. His design was smart, but too smart. On the nose, really, as I mentioned before. First, his outfit was white. I'm guessing an Italianish sort of military uniform, instantly contrasting with the rest of the team's color scheme and placing him away from us. On had an all-red color scheme, but it had black highlights and didn't have the white gold military style that he had. Also, in literally every scene of the team relaxing, he was strategically placed away from us, either looking in from the outside or looking away until it was time to go. This may be a bit forward as well, but I suspect the reason that his mask was in that design was based on the Plague Doctor's mask. Like he wore it so that we wouldn't infect him with our disease of going against the man. It was so painfully obvious that he was going to betray me. So every precious worry I had about my other team members just left my mind. I began to throw out his previous arguments against the Phantom Thieves in my head because of the obvious betrayal. I got really mad at the game for doing that to one of my favorite parts of it. The part where it actually was able to argue against the main characters. But, oh well, the mission happens, and then you get betrayed by him, and then end up in present day with a now caught up Sai, and encounter the game's first bad ending option of selling out your teammates for less jail time. If anyone did this, they were looking for a way to get the worst ending, it was obvious. Ultimately, you escape in a way that is so honestly convoluted and going between the metaverse and the real world at certain points. It was so badly explained Feel free to call me stupid for not immediately understanding, but it should have been a lot better explained. And I'm sure if it was, it would have had a larger impact. But the way they talked about it, I was in Sojiro's place. I didn't understand a word of what was going on. You then go through another dungeon and realize the problems are bigger than any individual criminal you try to hunt down, but societal. So you go to the bottom of mementos and you encounter the final boss, who whoops your butt and sends you back to the Velvet Room, where you meet with Igor and the girls. Igor says that you've failed and tells the girls to execute you. The girls then rebel against Igor, combine, and regain their memories of the fact that this Igor is actually a fake. I'd like to highlight this moment, as not a lot of people seem to have caught it, and I felt it was a really genius opportunity to take. The original Japanese voice actor for Igor, Isamu Tananaka, unfortunately passed away after Persona 4. I've kind of noticed a strange connection of a voice actor with a character in Japan, so much so that they're kind of treated as one and the same, so changing a VA is a really big deal. So when I heard the new, deeper voice for Igor, I chalked it up to the designers trying to take the character in a new direction with new casting and nothing else. However, having these girls realize that their master's voice was actually different in the end really just blew my mind. They used this rare opportunity to change the voice actor, so we as an audience wouldn't know either. And then used the voice of a much higher pitched voice actor like before as the real Igor. Incredibly well executed, and frankly, it blew my mind. When I first heard him, I noticed the voice, but I didn't even think that they would do something like this. It was great. You then gather your party and fight the final boss, like I described before, the Archangels and fighting the God of Order, fully completing the Order versus Chaos and religious themes. I talked about the ending earlier, so I won't go over it again. But essentially, that was the plot of Persona 5. If I had to describe it, I'd say it was 20% miss, but 80% hit. There was a lot more to enjoy about the specific dungeons, but ultimately I enjoyed the larger plot and themes. However, there were a lot of moments where I think the game expected me to be very surprised, but I knew it was going to happen. And then in the next, I was actually very surprised by how they took it. However, and you may have noticed me skim over it, I didn't mention the characters. Ultimately, I truly believe, upon recollection, that the characters presented here were so bland and forgettable that at best I remember the stories, and at worst it dragged down the overall game for me. When I finally figured out the issue I was having with the game, it was when I was talking it over with my friends for hours. Some of them haven't even played the game. Some of them haven't even played a game. I didn't care about any of these characters. Honest to God, I didn't feel connected to any one of them. I couldn't even remember half their stories, and that has never happened to me before, especially not in Persona. But now let's ask the question, what about it specifically made me not care? I won't go into specifics on each character, however. I want to do an episode on each character for games 3 through 5. But really, there wasn't any growth. In addition to most every character being one note to an absolute T, they never grew past their initial awakening. Think of any character at all, honestly. Ryuji was always loud and obnoxious, pre and post awakening, and everyone dumped on him throughout the game. Okay. Yosuke and Junpei were treated somewhat similarly in the beginning, but they got more respect as time went on, and it seems to be representative of their magician arcana. They also grew as time went on. Junpei accepted you as the leader and fell in love, while Yosuke decided his role was more to have your back and stood up for himself more. A lot more of how you were a leader by the end, while retaining the core of his personality. Now, where in the game does Ryuji grow? His social link went on about he kind of accepted that he was at fault for the team that he, I guess, broke up and everything. It was kind of confusing. In the end, honestly, it doesn't matter how the social link changes the character. It matters how they change throughout the story. Some of you may argue with me about this, but since the game doesn't account for the social link when talking about in-game cutscenes and general story progression, I treat them more as the side stories. important as they are, they do not mean that the character has changed in the game's universe by the end. It's only through the story. Think about it like this. None of the protagonists have ever canonically dated one girl. You might think it's Elizabeth, or your friend might think it's Aegis. Person might think it's Rise, but obviously someone's always going to be a Yukiko kind of guy. It doesn't matter what happens in the social links, it matters who the characters are by the end versus who they were in the beginning. It's only through the story that we can track a character growing. Ryuji never grew, and as such was a stale character. Hell, the entire team still treats him like crap at the end. Look when he saved all of them after the boat exploded. Yeah, they cried about it, but not only was it obvious they already cared about him, they just didn't admit it, and not only was it painfully obvious that he was alive, they kicked his ass afterwards for making him worry about him. It went past the normal of him just getting shit on, and it just felt mean. And Morgana, oh god, he was the epitome of a bad design decision. A bad design decision that we figured out a decade ago. His purpose was okay at best, just lead them down the mementos. Sounds like something they could have decided on their own to do while giving him some more interesting origin, but okay. What's stupid is that they attached a gameplay limiter to him. Think back to Fi from Skyward Sword, right? Everyone hated that girl. Even if you liked her, you kinda hated her because she constantly interrupted gameplay to explain stuff you already knew. Every time you picked up an item, she popped up. Every time you picked up the Master Sword, this is the Master Sword. I know it's the Master Sword. I remember just thinking to myself, I don't need a tutorial when I'm 2/3 of the way through the game. Nintendo shouldn't have done that already because they learned their mistake with making Navi have an annoying voice that constantly went off during gameplay. They replaced her in Majora's Mask with a fairy who chimed instead. In a game, story, aesthetics, and gameplay are always going to intersect. No matter how much you enjoy a character, if you attach them to something that has a bad gameplay design or interrupts good gameplay, they are going to be more disliked than liked. I didn't even mind the idea of him being her inner monologue. I think that's very clever, in fact. But the simple fact is that we associate him with stopping us from doing everything we want to at night, and that makes him a worse character, no matter how much you like him and his story. Who else? Yusuke never grew past artistic autist. Makoto was always just a mom and nothing else, even when she went crazy when her awakening happened and she became a biker for half a second. She never got mad again. I have to say, the only character with even the slightest amount of growth outside of her dungeon, rushed as it was, is Futaba. A girl who locked herself in a room for years, blaming herself for her mother's death after a week, is able to go to the beach. Among her friends, it was an amazing thing to watch happen in front of me, and to see her grow put her way above everyone else for me. Even if it was a little bit of fan service, that part kind of got to me when she stepped out from the cabana. Oh, God, I just remembered. I have to talk about Haru. Oh, how did anyone like this lifeless puffball? Most of the time, the well-endowed Reach girl is the best girl, but I guess that's one trope that the Persona team wanted to break this time. She made absolutely no sense whatsoever. It was insane to watch her arc in the dungeon play out. She obviously cared a lot about her father, even if you would argue that she didn't love him as much because he was trying to basically sell her away to another company and she realized how he thought of her as a pawn. She still loved him. Yeah, that's the thing. When he died in the metaverse, and then he died on TV suddenly, and all the black goop starts dripping out of his face, and she looks upon the gaze of her now drowning in his own muck father, I was thinking to myself, dear God, this girl is going to turn us in out of anger. But then, I get a text message of her asking us, hey, are you okay? Like, who cares? You should be pissed. Why are you not mad, you freak? What's wrong with you? She had no character whatsoever. And I see this desperate cling to a single line she said that she liked her grenade launcher or something, making her into a sadist and like a lot of fan art. It just proves to me that people are desperate to grasp any sense of motivation or character from this girl, while there aren't any to find. Every time I think back to that scene in the morning where she texts me, "Are you okay?" Honest to God, it pisses me off. These characters aren't characters anymore. They're like checkboxes to fill out for people who are looking for a quick waifu fix. I think the most egregious example of this has to be Kawakami. Her story touched me, really. The fact that she's willing to go as far as to prostitute herself for a student that she felt she tangentially murdered with her actions was amazingly well done. This sense of guilt that she exuded was, I don't know a good word for it, poignant. It was palpable. Her and No Good Tora I enjoyed a lot, but trying to hang out with her afterwards it was just kind of disgusting how she never grew. She hated that job, but constantly, and I mean constantly, brings up the fact that she was a maid. Like, I get it, lady. You're here to pander to the maid fetishists, but can you not see how this completely destroys her character? If the game focused more on her teaching, like it did sometimes when she was in post rank 10 dating mode and during the beach section, and not bringing up that she's just older than you and a prostitute, then she'd be good in my opinion. But all I know is when she called me master for the last time as I was saying goodbye, I felt my stomach churn at how badly this character turned out. Embarrassing. I think the best way to describe it is that the main cast turned out to act like side characters. The boy you helped to tutor in 4 was not well developed, but they kept him in a side story. We didn't care all that much. I liked him. Kenji was a dork whose entire character was fantasizing about older women, but again, fun side story. A model learning that she needs to try harder in her career that she's already talented at is, oh, okay, side story. Unfortunately, in this game, she was a main character whose only traits were her tits and cake. Now, was Persona 5 a bad game? No, not at all. In fact, I would not only confidently name it Game of the Year this early on, but I'd put it in the top 10 RPGs I've probably ever played. I had so much moment-to-moment fun, the story was interesting, and the aesthetics had such clear direction, it should be the gold standard by which all other RPGs, hell, games are judged. But will I care if Ryuji and I can still hang out? Will I care if I ever see Kawakami again? Will I be sad not seeing Yusuke's art? Will I be sad thinking of the fact that No Good Tora has a long way to go before he's accepted by society again? No. No. There's something about each ending to the Persona games that's very important. You die in 3 and leave your friends in 4. 4 lets you return every summer or Golden Week, but that's it. In 3, they resurrect you sometimes in order to get into a sick dance-off, but that's in the future. Because it's symbolic of you as a player leaving these friends behind and going out and being a better person from what you've learned. You'll always have the memories, just like them with you. In 5, you drive away with your friends, completely negating this metaphor. I think it's a perfect representation for this game. Great in the end, but seems like the Persona team needs to refocus and remember what made up the whole of these grand stories are the small, personal moments that not only made your friends grow, but you too.